The Supreme Court is now striking down both Harvard and UNC's program when it comes to race used in admissions. The court going forward in their decision saying they're going to set new limits on the use of race when it pertains to a particular student must be part of their individual story and not simply their identity.
The Supreme Court has ruled to narrow the scope in which race can be used to determine admissions in the nation's universities and colleges. Now, how was this case brought about? Just to go back, give you the context. Students for Fair Admissions, a conservative group, sued Harvard University and the University of North Carolina over their race-conscious admissions programs, alleging intentional discrimination toward Asian American applicants. So the court held in an opinion for the conservative majority written by Chief Justice John Roberts that Harvard and UNC's admissions programs violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And that was the constitutional argument that the plaintiffs brought forward in this case. And the Supreme Court justices, the majority of them agreed with that. The vote was 6-3 in the UNC case and 6-2 in the Harvard case, with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson recusing herself in the Harvard case specifically. Now, both programs, according to John Roberts, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race, unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints. We have never permitted admissions programs to work in that way, and we will not do so today. Now, race can still be considered, although in a far more limited way in the admissions process, and I'll explain how that works in just a moment. Before I do, Cenk, what do you think about this ruling?
Okay, brace for impact, I agree with it. So I've actually said that I'm against affirmative action probably dozens of times on this show, but nonetheless, people are surprised whenever you go outside of orthodoxy. So I think affirmative action was definitely correct in the beginning. I'll give you a quick example of why. So for example, if you're, just pick a random profession, you're a longshoreman, you got a good job, it pays decent wages back then, right? It started in the 1960s. And you want to pass your job on to your kids. That makes sense. I get it. I get your motivation behind it. But at the time, only white people had those jobs. So they would constantly pass their jobs on to other white people, their kids, which again, as a parent, I get it, but we had to allow minorities to break into that system. And we had to do that at every level for jobs, universities, etc., because folks did not have an opportunity, okay? But after a while, it becomes stigmatizing. So I'll give you another anecdote. When I was in law school, I remember back then I was a Republican, and I remember being with a couple other Republican students, and I said about one of our classmates and someone who I was friends with, but they didn't know that. They said, "Oh yeah, I wonder how he got in here." And I thought, and I said, by being a great student. But for them, every minority, it doesn't matter if they went to Harvard, Princeton, where, Yale, Stanford, nothing mattered. It was disqualified because of their race. Oh, they didn't earn it. And I think that has had a massively corrosive effect in this country against minorities. So I think it has now become counterproductive. I agree with the Supreme Court's decision. I have more on that, but that's my initial
So
thoughts.
I want to talk about how they did limit the scope in which race can be considered, right? So for instance, what the justices argue, or at least Chief Justice John Roberts, is that the struggles or the challenges or whatever the applicant has gone through as a result of their race can be considered. And how would it be considered? Well, there are multiple ways. One of the main ways could be through their essay. Now, those who disagree with the decision here argue, well, then that forces students of color to write their essays about race. Maybe they wanted to write their essays about something else. But nonetheless, I do want to give you some more details on that. Roberts wrote, Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, at the same time, as all parties agree, nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. And someone named David Hinojosa, who argued the case before the court, said that while the ruling did, quote, make it heck of a lot harder to use race as a factor in admissions, it would not totally prevent universities from pursuing diversity goals similar to affirmative action. He told the New York Times this, comparing this ruling to the reversal of Roe v. Wade. As you all know from last summer, when this court wants to overrule precedent, it knows how to overrule precedent, and that language is not in Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, he said, referring to the court's sweeping decision overturning Roe v. Wade. The court said that it has permitted race-based admissions only within the confines of narrow restrictions. University programs must comply with strict scrutiny. They may never use race as a stereotype or negative, and at some point they must end.
Yeah, so all right, first of all, I again agree with them. I think it definitely should be considered within the context of the essay. They should not use the essay as a proxy. Wink, wink, tell me about your race and I'll let you in. But as long as they're taking a genuine look at the essay, oftentimes what you have overcome is probably the #1 indicator, in my opinion, of whether you'll be successful in school or anything else. Honestly, when I interview people for employment here at TYT, that's my #1 question. Well, tell me some adversity you had and how you overcame it. Because that tells you the character of a person and how hard they're gonna work and how they're gonna persevere, etc. And that'll get you, the size of the fight in the person is by far the most important thing. And oftentimes that is told in an essay. And oftentimes it is overcoming some sort of racial boundary or income boundary, which then leads me to saying, I think the much better way to go, and I think they should use this, is class-based affirmative action rather than race-based affirmative action. And I know that a lot of people will say, okay, enough with affirmative action, period, right? And others will say, no, it has to be race-based. But I don't know why a poor white kid in Appalachia, it doesn't have a bigger disadvantage than the Obama kids in Martha's Vineyard. Sorry. Okay, so I know that's gonna make a lot of people uncomfortable. Doesn't mean race is not relevant. I understand the context of race,
right,
and I understand how it's a disadvantage. Having said that, in these contexts, I think class is a giant disadvantage. I think the poor are overwhelmed by the rich.
Right.
And then that leads me to the last point here in this context, Anna, sorry. Legacy admissions. Legacy admissions are an abomination, and they help the rich more than anyone else. It's when you're an alumni of a school and your kid applies, they have a far, far better chance of getting in. By the way, we have a petition about that, and you can see the link in the description box, tyt.com/petitions, and legacy admissions, because it's way worse than affirmative action.
Yeah, I mean, look, just going back to the point that you made about class, I think class is a better indicator of the struggles that a student had to overcome in order to get to the point that they're at as they're applying for college admissions. So what I think made me support affirmative action, or the part of affirmative action that I thought, let me reword this. The strongest case I heard in support of affirmative action really had to do with, the fact that Black and Latino students are overrepresented when it comes to lower socioeconomic statuses, right? And with that means you don't have the extra money or the extra resources for, special tutoring outside of school, right? Or for extra lessons on how to take the SAT test and how to excel at the SAT test, right? Those types of classes, that type of instruction is very, very expensive. And we know how education is funded in some districts, right? A lot of it relies on property taxes. Other states have found better ways to kind of fund public schools, so it's far more equal, but that's not the case in every state. And so I liked that argument, but I think it's a mistake to tie that argument simply to race. I think that argument works better when you focus on class. Yeah. Because as you mentioned, there are plenty of disadvantaged, poor white kids as well who have to go through a lot and have to fight a lot harder in order to get the kind of education and gain the kind of merit necessary to get accepted into these universities.
So some are already criticizing me on social media, etc.
Oh wow, that's.
I know that's a shocking turn of events. Saying that I'm trying to appease. This is the latest thing we're doing where I'm trying to appease the right wing. Hilarious. Okay, so first of all, if that's true, that's interesting because I've had this opinion my entire life. So was I doing it 20 years ago. I wrote a passage in my book for about 4 years ago against affirmative action. It's in the book, you can see it. I didn't invent it yesterday, okay? And so, look, just because you're in one side of the political spectrum doesn't mean that you have to agree with every single position. And this is not because, oh golly gee, it's so unfair to white people. No, that's not the issue at all. It's, hey, how are minorities perceived? What is fair, what is just, what is the most productive way to go forward so that we eliminate racism? But I'll give you more examples. Look, let's take my family. So we're all the same race, obviously, we're the same family, kind of. You'll see my kid is, of course, half Asian. But my dad was an incredibly poor farmer in southeastern Turkey. I grew up middle class thanks to the heroic work of my dad and free college that he got in Turkey. My son is now growing up in an even better situation. We're all the same race. Should we all be treated the same when going into school? No, my son is 1,000 times better off than his grandfather was. 1,000 times. So my dad needed the help. He needed the help the most when he's a farmer and he's broke and he needs that hand up to get him up, okay? I didn't need the break as much. I don't think my kid needs the break at all, okay? So if you say that's outrageous, you have to take race into consideration, I'm sorry, I don't agree. Now, if you say, hey, Jake, you're not the relevant race here, okay, that's a fairer point. But I could make the same exact point about African American families, Latino families, etc., right? And so if you're, and yes, African Americans, Latinos, unfortunately still in this country, are in a lower socioeconomic class because of the history of discrimination and racism. That is definitely true, okay? But having said that, if you do it based on class, you're gonna help those same people anyway, but you're gonna direct it more to the people who actually need it, as opposed to the son of the CEO of Coke, all right? Or there's some incredibly successful African Americans in this country. Their kids don't need it nearly as much as any kid race that's poor and has to overcome so much more.
And prior to this ruling, I should note that there were 8 states that had outlawed affirmative action in the college admissions process. So California was actually the first, and they did so in the 1990s, followed by Washington, which actually repealed their ban just last year. Then there's Florida, Michigan, Nebraska, Arizona, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Idaho. I also wanted to just quickly go over the dissenting opinion. Justice Sonia Sotomayor actually spoke and gave a speech about her dissent, and here's what she said. Today, the court concludes that indifference to race is the only constitutionally permissible means to achieve racial equality in college admissions. That interpretation of the 14th Amendment is not only contrary to precedent and the entire teachings of our history, but it is also grounded in the illusion that racial inequality was a problem of a different generation. She continues, entrenched racial inequality remains a reality today. That is true for society writ large, and more specifically for Harvard and the University of North Carolina, 2 institutions with a long history of racial exclusion. Ignoring race will not equalize a society that is racially unequal. What was true in the 1860s, 1860s, and again in 1954 is true today. Equality requires acknowledgement of inequality.
Yeah, look, guys, in today's climate, what happens is people say, and this has been true for a long time, if you're on a side of an issue, this is either the issue is either 100% correct or 0% correct, and we have to argue it in the extremes. No, in the case of affirmative action, if you take it away, will it hurt some minorities? Yes, it will, okay? You have to be honest about that, even if you're in favor of taking affirmative action. Why? For example, when California and Texas did it, yes, there were less blacks and Latinos admitted into the top schools. By the way, they got into the lower level schools, okay? And some of those schools are great, like UC Santa Barbara, UC Riverside, etc. But that's okay, but But it did happen. It did happen. You can't deny that it didn't happen.
Okay, so let me jump in actually, because look, I think it's actually incredibly important to have diverse campuses, right? And it's not just about equality, it's also about ensuring that all students are exposed to diversity, to different cultures, to people with different backgrounds. That actually enhances your higher education experience. And so some of the states that outlawed, I can't remember exactly which state it was, but one of these states that outlawed affirmative action ended up deciding, okay, in order to fix the lack of diversity problem, all students who are at the top 10% of their graduating class will automatically get admitted to the state colleges, right?
Yep.
Which, I mean, that means for anyone who wants that opportunity, it's open for them.
Yeah, and so that's a different way of tackling the problem. I think a better way to tackle it, I would do it purely class-based. But the reason why that works is because, hey, that if you're in a public school, and some of the public schools unfortunately are awful, right? But you made it into the top 10%, that means you're a fighter. You got that exact spirit we're looking for that we think can do amazing things in the world. And a lot of those kids in Texas were Latino, right? But all mixed races, etc. But at least they had a shot within their environment, their school. They excelled, and that shows you the fight they got in them, right? And how they overcome adversity. So I love that. But guys, now let's talk about the downside of affirmative action, or a downside of keeping affirmative action. You get rid of it, yes, you have less representation from some groups, at least in the short term, right? For sure. Now, the downside of keeping it is, so forever we're going to subliminally, subconsciously tell everybody minorities can't make it on their own. They need a boost up. Oh, I hate that. I can't stand that. And that's a poison that gets into all of our heads. And so, look here, another anecdote. So I remember the kids who I thought were the smartest at the schools I went to. I don't know why I remember it, but I do. At Columbia, there was this Orthodox Jewish kid where I thought, wow, that kid's smart, right? And at Penn, I remember talking to, it was a freshman, talking to a black student about science and math. And I was like, I'm never going to know what this guy knows. Super freaking smart. And for whatever reason, it just burrowed into my head. And I remember those two kids, okay? So that black kid who went to Penn, who was a freaking genius, for his whole life, people will look like, oh, how did you get into Penn? Oh, Jesus, that pisses me off to no end, right? And that's, I'm telling you, people are underestimating the poison that idea is, right? That no minority ever earned what they got in this country.
It perpetuates stereotypes.
It 100% perpetuates it. And if you say, hey, people shouldn't think that way, well, I agree with you. But nonetheless, they do. If you think they don't, you're kidding yourself. You know that they think that way, and you think affirmative action, unfortunately, buttresses that in their minds. Last thing, it is also fundamentally unfair to Asians. Okay, it just is. And again, if you're denying that reality, it's absurd to deny it. The minute you take away affirmative action anywhere, the Asian admission rates skyrocket, okay? Why? Is it because Asians are smarter? No, don't be insane, okay? No, because there's a culture of super valuing education, almost to an extreme and almost to a point where I go, I don't know that you're going in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
But having said that, like, so we're gonna tell all Asians, yeah, even though you guys earned it, we're just not gonna let half of you in because we're trying to do diversity. Look, it's super complicated. Look at all the factors that I just outlined, right? But is that a factor? Yeah, it's a factor that we're being obviously and brazenly unjust to a certain minority group in the country. And in this case, it happens to be Asians. And for white folks who are like white right-wingers, are like, yeah, finally, man, affirmative action's over, white people are back. I got really bad news for you. Affirmative action was helping you.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay,
it's true.
Without affirmative action, white rates plummet, Asian rates increase. So all those white wingers celebrating today, you're not gonna be celebrating tomorrow. But it is more fair. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.